My wife told me that I shouldn't move around so much because I'm on YouTube now. So I'm going to try to stay right here if this doesn't throw me. We're in the process of looking at what happened in basically the 4 centuries before the life of Christ. And in those 400 years, often referred to as the silent years, but they were really anything but that, as you'll see as we go along. And we were in the process of looking at the empires that ruled Palestine leading up to the time of Christ. And we had looked at basically what's referred to as the Grecian Error. This is after the conquest of Alexander the Great. His conquests were divided, and after his death, and his generals, he had 5 major generals, and we're down to, basically, we're going to be looking at 2 of them. The first one is Ptolemies, who ruled Egypt and northern coast of France, or Africa, and region of Palestine. And one of the things that began to happen during that time is this is where we finished last week. During the latter part of the Ptolemaic era, 2 religious factions began to emerge. And it's not uncommon to what we see today in other religions. You have supposedly a liberal element and a more conservative element. And in this case, there were 2 groups. One was pro-Syrian Hellenizing party. They turned out to be what developed from that faction was the Sadducees. And then the other was a more orthodox group. These are the ones that believed in the Pentateuch and what was given to Moses, and they didn't want to get away from that. So you see the Orthodox Jews, and in particular, there's one group called the Hasidim, or the pious ones, and they turned out to be what emerged from this group were the predecessors of the Pharisees and the Essenes. And this struggle of the 2 groups, the 2 factions, we're going to see all the way to the end of Jerusalem or end of Judea in 70 AD, when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. Okay. So what we want to look at now is what we call the Seleucid or Syrian period. After years of conflict between the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids of Syria in 198 BC, the Seleucids defeated the Ptolemies. I keep wanting to add that P to it, but it's not, it's silent. Ptolemies in a battle in northern Palestine, and gained full control of Palestine. an interesting aspect of this is that the Ptolemy dynasty retained control of Egypt until the last Ptolemy, Cleopatra III, committed suicide with her lover, Mark Antony, the Roman. So what that amounts to is what a lot of people don't realize is that Egypt was ruled by Greeks, for over 300 years. Cleopatra III committed suicide in about 37 BC. Okay. Now, for the most part, the Seleucids let the Israelites, Judea, rule themselves, even though they were harshly treated. But you still have these two groups, and they're beginning to show themselves a little bit more. The new ruler of Palestine in 198 BC was Antiochus III. He was a direct descendant of Seleucus I, who was one of Alexander's original generals. And though the Jews were treated pretty harshly, they were allowed to rule themselves. And remember that was under the control of the high priest. And though they were treated harshly, they were allowed to rule themselves. However, in 168 BC, the Hellenizing Jews, those pro-Syrian Jews, bribed the current ruler, and this is a son of the third, Antiochus Antiochus, I have to say these slowly, Antiochus, the fourth, Epiphanes, to appoint a high priest they favored. So there's a lot of political skullduggery and shenanigans going on. But this set off almost a rebellion. Okay. And this Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, and by the way, the word Epiphanes means God manifests. This guy was also called the madman. We'll see why in a minute. But in response to this, where he, under a bribe, appointed the high priest, it caused a violent political conflict that brought Antiochus from Babylon to Jerusalem in a fit of rage. He was going to destroy Judaism once and for all. He was tired of putting up with it and all the infighting. So he outlawed or forbade all Jewish religious practices. Okay. He forbade all sacrifices in the temple. He outlawed the rite of circumcision. He canceled all Sabbath events. And he disallowed all Jewish feast days, any celebrations for these feast days. And on top of that, he had a massive book burning. He took the Torah, the Pentateuch, and all the copies that he could find, he burned. And if anybody was caught studying the Torah, they were subject to execution. He was trying to destroy everything. But his final act that really set him off, that caused further problems, was he built an altar in the holy temple to Zeus, and he sacrificed a pig on it and forced the people to partake of that. And if they didn't, execution again. So, from Jerusalem, his forces went into the countryside around Jerusalem, forcing everyone to sacrifice a pig. And remember that pork was unclean to the Jews. God had, in his dietary laws, prohibited the consumption of pork. Why do you think he did that, by the way? Yes.
If pork is not cooked, there's a parasite can pass the whole.
Say it again.
If pork is not well cooked, well done, you don't leave it there. There's
Yes.
a parasite can pass on. Husbandry's kind of taking care of that, but that's what it is.
You can tell an old lag guy there. Pork, they were scavengers back in that day and time. And so pork would be infested with parasites. Trichinosis is the most common one. But God forbade them from eating pork. So for them to eat pork would be an apostasy from Roman law. So he went around, had troops go around into the countryside, forcing people to sacrifice a pig and to eat of the pork. And if they didn't, they were executed on the spot. Now, here's where it gets kind of interesting. A contingent of Antiochus IV's soldiers entered a small Jewish settlement. This is in the rural settlement of Modian. It's about 10 miles north of Jerusalem, small village. And so these soldiers would be enforcing his apostasy from the Jewish law, from Mosaical law. And the priests, or the king's officers that entered this little town, they pleaded with the old village priest, Mattathias. And if you do this, you'll be the friend of the king, is the way it's described. If you sacrifice and eat this pork, you would become the king's friend. Way to go, if you would do that. But Mattathias is a Levite. In his response, wait, let me back up a minute. Oh, yeah, I've already covered that. Okay. Now, I'm going to be using a quote from the book of Maccabees. And these are the Old Testament side of the Apocrypha. And they're more or less a historical account. They don't contain any doctrine as far as we're concerned, so to speak. They don't offer anything except a historical account of what happened. And Mattathias was very, very orthodox. So this is what he said when the officer told him to eat the pork. He said, "But Mattathias answered and said in a loud voice, even if all the nations that live under the rule of the king obey him and have chosen to do his commandments, departing each one from the religion of their fathers, yet I and my sons and my brothers will live by the covenant of our fathers. Far be it from us to desert the law and ordinances. We will not obey the king's words by turning aside from our religion to the right hand or to the left hand." He wasn't going to do it. But when he had finished speaking these words, I'm still reading from First Maccabees. When he had finished speaking these words, the Jew came forward in the sight of all to sacrifice a pig. He wanted to be the king's friend. Sight of all to sacrifice a pig upon the altar erected in Modin according to the king's commandments. When Mattathias saw it, he burned with zeal, and his heart was stirred, and he gave vent to righteous anger. He ran and killed this Jew upon the altar. At the same time, he killed the king's officer who had been forcing them to sacrifice. And Josephus' account indicates that his sons helped him. He had 5 sons that helped him. At the same time, after he killed this Jew, he killed the king's officer who was forcing them to sacrifice, and he tore down the altar. Thus he burned with zeal for the law as Phinehas did against Zimri and the son of Shalu. Mattathias cried out in the city with a loud voice, saying, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports a covenant come out with me." And he and his sons fled into the hills and left all they had in that city. Who's Phinehas? Well,
he's the one that speared the 2 lovers.
Say it again.
He's the one that ran the spear through the 2 lovers who were
Yep.
sacrificed, whatever,
Let's see, I have
on the
it.
altar, that kind of stuff, in the tent of meeting or something like that.
Well, I have it somewhere. Here we go. The context of Phinehas is found in Numbers 25. And this is when the Israelites were still wandering in their 40 years, and they were camped next to the Moabite nation, and they were taking some wives of the Moabites. And this was enraging to God and enraging to Moses. And so he called all the people together and told them that they're going to have to get rid of these wives. Okay? And as he was telling them this, the Israelite, it said in verse 6 of Numbers 25, "And behold, one of the people of Israel came through with a Midianite woman to his family." In other words, he had married her. She was now part of his family. "In the sight of Moses and in the sight of the whole congregation of the people of Israel, while they were weeping in the entrance of the tent of meeting. So here's Moses telling the people, you can't do that anymore. You're going to have to stop that. And here this guy comes in bringing his wife new wife. It says, verse 7, when Phinehas saw the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest saw it, when Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, and the son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he rose up and left the congregation, and on his way out he picked up a spear, went after the man of Israel into the chamber. This was his honeymoon bedroom, and pierced both of them, the man of Israel and the woman, through her belly. Thus the plague of the people of Israel was stopped. So Mattathias had this same rage and was indignant toward the Jewish man that offered the pig, and had the same zeal for the law as Phinehas had. Okay? So they went into the hills and started this rebellion. Now, a while back, it's been when the prime minister of Israel was Netanyahu, he gave the obituary for one of their famous generals. And in the obituary, he said, this man possessed the spirit of the Maccabees. So they still think of him and are aware of him to this day. Mattathias had 5 sons: Judas Maccabeus, Eleazar, Simeon, John, and Jonathan. Mattathias was from the Hasmonean lineage of the Levites, was from such a period from 165 to 63 BC is often referred to as the Hasmonean Error. Mattathias died within a year, and leadership of the revolt fell to Judah, and his 3rd son, wasn't his oldest, but he was nicknamed Maccabeus. So, and the Maccabeus nickname means a hammerer, because he fought several successful battles against much larger forces. He was the ideal fierce guerrilla leader. So the rebellion is often referred to as the Maccabean Revolt. Can you imagine something that's named after a nickname and something like this? Well, supported by the Hasidim, remember that's that Orthodox group we looked at before, very devout, fearless fighters, and with many victories against larger forces, he was able to retake Jerusalem in less than 3 years. The temple was cleansed of all Seleucidan defilements and rededicated exactly 3 years after the desecration in 168 BC. December the 25th, 165 BC. And that rededication is remembered today in the Jewish feast of Hanukkah, or the Jewish feast of lights. But they still remember that and honor that in this celebration. Maccabeus, Judah Maccabeus, was nicknamed Maccabeus, the hammer, in reference to his weapon of choice. And I think what's depicted here is a small version of the hammer. Those war hammers were usually about 3 to 4 feet long. But he was a very successful fighter, very fierce He was an excellent guerrilla leader, and he was able to overcome the Seleucids, and the rebellion is referred to as the Maccabean Revolt. Well, it took more than 2 decades of fighting before the Maccabees were able to completely drive out the Seleucids from Palestine. So in 142 BC, for the first time in more than 500 years, the Jews were free. They were not ruled by anybody. They were their own masters of their own fate. It would last for 80 years. But there were some problems. The Hasmoneans claimed not only the throne of Judah, one of them would be king, but also the post of the high priest. Ultimately, as you can imagine, internal divisions and the arrival of yet another super imperial power were to put an end to this Jewish independence in the land of Israel for more than 2 millennia. It would not be till 1948 till the Jews were free again. But this problem that I mentioned earlier still existed. Herein lies a problem that existed to 70 AD when Jerusalem, Judea was destroyed. The high priest was not only the Jewish pope, he was also the President Trump of their civil government. Well, like it was mentioned, it lasted for 80 years, but there was lots of going on. And I haven't included that because it would take too much time to tell what went on. But suffice it to say that there were a lot of problems that brought down their own destruction. Toward the end of the Hasmonean period, there was considerable chaos and much infighting between various Hasmonean factions and other political groups. And that's going to be the Pharisees and the Sadducees that came out of the Maccabean Revolt. We'll dwell on that a little bit more later on. The Roman general Pompey saw an opportunity in the midst of all this chaos, invaded Palestine in 63 BC, defeated the Hasmoneans, and turned Palestine into a Roman province. They really brought about their own destruction because the Hasmoneans wanted all the power, and that didn't work out. They weren't democratic in any way whatsoever. With the Romans, various puppet leaders were installed. Herod the Great in 37 BC, with the help of the Roman army, he gains control of all Judea and becomes king of Judea. He's declared king of Judea by the Roman Senate. Herod carries out many building projects, including rebuilding the temple. He was actually refurbishing it. Jesus Christ is born about 4 BC to 2 BC. John the Baptist begins his preaching around 25 AD. And technically speaking, that's the end of the intertestamental period. Okay? So what we've looked at are the empires that ruled Palestine before the time of Christ. First, we looked at the Persian period, then the Grecian period, That was after Alexander's great conquest. In the Grecian period, there were two eras that were controlled by Greeks, and they Hellenization was one of their big pushes as much as possible. And then we had Maccabean or Hasmonean Error for about 80 years, or they were about 100 years, but their rule did not come until, or complete rule till 142, which is about 80 years. And then we had the Roman period. Now, that's empires that ruled Palestine. While this was going on, there were three events that occurred during the intertestamental period that are very much related to each other. Come on. The Jews were being scattered all over the country, all over the Mediterranean area, the nations surrounding the Mediterranean. More devout Jews in the dispersion needed a substitute for the temple worship. Obviously, they couldn't go back to Jerusalem. And during the course of time, they forgot about Hebrew, the language. And so they had to have some other way. Somebody had to help them translate from their native language into the Hebrew language. All right. Well, some things began to happen. And the three events, and all of these are tied in together, is the diaspora, the dispersion, synagogues, and the Septuagint. Okay. The diaspora, there's how you pronounce it, or the dispersion. It's mentioned 3 times in the New Testament. I'll show you those in a minute. Now, it's a comprehensive designation applied to Jews living outside of Judea, Palestine, and maintaining their religious observances and customs among the Gentiles. They were still Jews among the Gentiles, and they were known as the diaspora or dispersion, an expression describing them in relation to the nations among them and where they were scattered. On a notable occasion, Christ recognized this. The Pharisees heard in John chapter 7, verse 32, the Pharisees heard the crowd muttering these things about him, and the chief priests and the Pharisees sent officers to arrest him. Jesus then said, I will be with you a little longer, and I'm going to him who sent me. You will seek me, and you will not find me. Where I am, you cannot come. And when the Jews heard this, they said to one another, what does this man intend to do? Where he will go, and we will not find him? Does he intend to go to the dispersion among the Greeks and teach the Greeks? How would you answer that question? Well, the first question is no, and the second question is yes. Jesus did not leave Palestine, so he didn't go to any of the dispersion. But who did?
Oh,
His apostles. And what they take? gospel. Okay? They took the gospel. So, in a sense, he did go to the Greeks, but he had messengers. Now, just understanding that the diaspora was not something that they were unfamiliar with. At least 4 times in the Old Testament, the Israelites were warned by God through his prophets that if they didn't obey Jehovah God, this was a possibility. And in Hosea, talks about they're going to be sent away. I'm not going to read these word for word. Jeremiah, in all the places that I've driven them, declares the Lord. In Zechariah, though I scattered them among the nations, and when all of these things come upon you, this is all the way in Deuteronomy, right after they came out of Egypt. When all these things come upon you, the blessings and the curse, which I've said before you, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you. So, the actual dispersion of the Jews started with the Assyrians in 733. Okay, in 733 BC, the Assyrians captured most of Israel. They kind of did it in stages. They would exile 2 tribes, and then later 2 more tribes, and then later a couple more tribes. Technical difficulties.
Try the escape key, Joe. Escape key.
Yes, sir.
My clicker is not working. There we go. 2 Kings 15, verse 29. In the days of Pekah, king of Israel, came, and you can figure out what that is, king of Assyria, and took all of those guys in Gilead, Galilee, all the land of Naphtali, and carried them captive to Syria. Now, gives a little more detail in Chronicles. Here we go. Chronicles. In 2 Chronicles 15, verse 21, 2 Kings, we 2 Chronicles 5, again, verse 21, it says, well, I must have written, it's 15. What happens when you can't read your own handwriting. 2 Chronicles 15, verse 21. Well, I must have wrote it down wrong, but obviously, but it tells what they took. And what they took captive were the people that could do work. They left the old and some of the young, etc., back in Israel, but they took these good guys, these able guys, to Assyria, probably Nineveh. It was the capital at that time. This was followed by the Babylonian captivity in 600 BC. Nebuchadnezzar defeated the Assyrians, and in 2 Kings 24, verse 16, and the king of Babylon brought captive to Babylon all the men of valor, 7,000 the craftsmen and metal workers, 1,000, all of them strong and fit for war. So when they took these people that would wind up as slaves, they took the healthy and the strong. And what they left in Palestine were those that weren't that. They were old, etc. By the time of Christ, we're describing the dysphoria diaspora. By the time of Christ, there were large communities of Jews scattered across the ancient world, and there were estimates, for example, of 200,000 Jews in Antioch of Syria. Remember, this is Paul's home base for his missionary journeys, and there were 250,000 Jews in Alexandria of Egypt. And 63 BC, after Pompey had conquered the Palestinians, he carried a large number of Jews captive as slaves to Rome. And many of these would earn their freedom to go on to become citizens of Rome. And an ancient historian, and by 150 BC, said, "Every land and every sea is full of thee," referring to the Jews. So this was a significant group of people. It's no surprise, therefore, to read that at the Feast of Pentecost in Jerusalem, after the ascension of Jesus, there were Parthians and Medes and Elamites and the dwellers in Mesopotamia, in Judah, in Cappadocia, in Pontus, and in Asia, in Phrygia and Pamphylia, in Egypt and parts of Libya and about Cyrene, and the sojourners from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabians. This is the dysphoria at the time of Pentecost. And every one of the cities and areas outlined in yellow, highlighted in yellow, are all mentioned right here. Parthia, Media, the Medes, well, I'll get it in a minute. In verse 8 of chapter 2, how is it that we hear each of our own language in where we were born? The Parthians, the Medes, and the, wait, go back. There we go. Anyway, they're all named around there in addition to that, everything that's highlighted, little towns that are highlighted in yellow had a synagogue. So the area in the light green is the extent of the Roman Empire. So about everywhere the Roman Empire was, you would find the dispersion. All right. I thought this slide was pretty impressive if you get right down to it, to show the scatter of the dysphoria. Okay. Whatever the reason for their dispersion as exiles or immigrants. Oh, I forgot one. Let me go back just a minute. Right here. There is an interesting archaeological discovery. Numerous archaeological discoveries confirm the existence of Jewish communities within Egypt along the southern Nile as early as the 10th century BC. Who are these guys? I'll give you a hint.
Ones that never followed out.
Say it again.
Well, when they left the slavery, they stayed. Some of them stayed.
Well, I'll give you a hint again. This is a time of Solomon, 10th century BC. Who came to visit Solomon?
Sheba.
Queen of Sheba. And legend has it that when she went back to Sheba, which is now considered Ethiopia, she carried the son of Solomon. And Solomon may have sent some immigrants with her. There was also the possibility that this was a trade mission, because Solomon was in the process of building his temple, and there was lots of commerce going up and down the Nile, and she would provide some assistance there. But anyway, that's just a kind of a side note. Whatever the reason for the dispersion as exiles or immigrants, they did not withdraw into the local culture and disappear. They were, what's the term we use today? Entrepreneurs. The Jewish people were. And they were quite successful. I think that's why a lot of people didn't like them. They did not withdraw into the local culture and disappear. They would use their various trade skills and become viable parts of the local communities. They were also witnesses for the true living God and were able to gain many new adherents, proselytes. Jesus recognized the dispersion of the Jews and the hypocrisy of the scribes and Pharisees when he said, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte, and when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves." So Jesus recognized the dispersion. This shows the extent of the dispersion in the year 14 AD, when Tiberius became emperor of Rome. So everything that's gray there is the extent of the dispersion. And how many of these places would be visited by the Apostle Paul? We're not sure about the other apostles, but it was pretty widespread in this time. Well, wherever Paul and his traveling missionary companions went into the synagogue or places of prayer, it was the Jews of the diaspora that were first encountered. And where'd they go? They went into synagogues. Okay? Well, where'd the synagogues come from? History suggests that when they were in exile in Babylonia, this is when the foundation of the synagogues can be found. The synagogue was, in the time of Christ, one of the most important and widespread religious institutions of the Jews. It most likely came into being during the Babylonian exile. At that time, the more devout Jews, far from their native land, having no sanctuary altar, no doubt felt drawn from time to time, especially on the Sabbath and feast days, to gather around those who were especially pious and God-fearing, in order to listen to the word of God and engage in some kind of worship. This even developed as a replacement for the temple, although there were no sacrifices, and must have been absolutely necessary for the Jews of the dispersion, for it would be next to impossible for a Jewish male to travel to Jerusalem 3 times a year, every year, to attend these annual feasts. So the 3 feasts are unleavened bread or Passover. This is usually in early April. The Feast of Pentecost, which is usually in the month of what we would think of as June. And then the Feast of Ingathering, or the Feast of Booths. I got a typographical error there. Booths, or no, I didn't, or of Tabernacles. This was usually in September, late September. So it'd be impossible for 4 million Jews in the diaspora to make it to Jerusalem 3 times a year, every year. So you would see the need for a synagogue. They would become the focal points of Jewish communities of the dispersion, more than places of worship, but a site of instruction for Jewish children and adults. And Jesus would use these in that way. In Matthew 4, verse 23, it says he went throughout Galilee teaching in the synagogues. In Mark 1:21 and Luke 4:31, it says he taught in the synagogue on the Sabbath. But what's important in those 2 verses, he taught them as one who had authority and not as the scribes. And in John 18, begin verse 19, when the high priests were questioning him, Jesus, about his disciples and teaching, Jesus answered him, and I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all Jews came together. I have said nothing in secret. Okay,
The second bell rang.
okay. So, this is a good place to stop anyway. So the Jews are scattered everywhere in the ancient world at that time. There's some indication that they may have been further north into Jerusalem or into Germany and places like that. We don't know that for sure. And then the synagogues had become very, very important. Okay? But you see how these things are tied together. Because the next thing we're going to look at is the fact that they were losing how to understand and use the Hebrew language. And they had to do something else. So come next week and find out what they did. Thank you for being here.